Hi, everybody, and welcome to this live briefing. My name is Pat Norman, and I work with Sydney Executive Plus. We're an initiative of the University of Sydney Business School, and we'll be hosting today's briefing on the net zero transition and the impacts of the election. But before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that the University of Sydney is built on the grounds of the Gadigal people of Eora Nation. I'm currently at our CBD campus, and Gordon and Deanna, who are joining us for our briefing today, also on the main campus of the university at the business school. And so we'd like to recognise that there's a long tradition of coming together to learn from each other, and a long tradition of a custodianship of environment. And I think that's really important for us to recognise when we're having conversations about net zero and our climate. So we're really proud to continue a tradition of learning that has been going on in this country for tens of thousands of years. So welcome again to this briefing today, the business briefing for net zero. We're a few days out from the Australian election, and the implications are quite high for what this means for business. There are different policies coming through from the government, and I'm very excited from the government and from the opposition. I'm very excited to hear from Deanna and Gordon, who'll be sharing a bit of an update on where is the net zero transition at globally, and what are some of the implications of these developments, both from the election and also more broadly for our net zero transition, what that means for you and for business. So Deanna, Director of the Net Zero Institute, and Gordon, who is a decarbonisation expert and works with Deanna in the Net Zero Institute here at the University of Sydney. Welcome. Thanks so much for your time today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, Pat, and welcome everybody. And thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us. We hope today is going to be a really useful briefing. My name's Deanna, as Pat mentioned. I'm a Professor of Materials Chemistry here at the university, and I've worked predominantly in Australia, but also in the United States over the last 20 years or so as a professional in this field, as well as being a researcher and a teacher here at the university. I'm also, as Pat mentioned, Director of the Net Zero Institute. And over to Gordon.
And I'm Gordon. I work with Deanna at the Net Zero Institute. I also teach at the School of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering at the university. Prior to coming to the university, I'd worked for around 25 years in an energy and climate change consultancy, advising large organisations on energy management, decarbonisation, and carbon and climate-related strategies. I should also declare that since we're talking about the policies of the political parties, that I'm also a member of the New South Wales Liberal Party.
Thanks.
So over to Deanna.
Thank you, Gordon. So maybe before coming to the federal election, it's maybe worth just dwelling a little bit on the international landscape, because it's an interesting time in the world's history. And I think it's easy to say and fair to say that it's a bit of a dark forest out there. The international agreements underpinning the response to climate change, such as the Paris Agreement, have relied on quite benign international conditions, which have been free largely of great power conflicts. But we were in a unipolar world with only one great power, that being the United States. And we had a relatively stable financial system with record low interest rates. And in fact, the long period of low interest rates in the previous decade was unprecedented in the 5,000-year history of interest rates. We're also in an era of globalisation with, of course, the offshoring of supply chains. But I think we'd all agree those days are gone. With the rise of China, the unipolar world is no more, and we're seeing the world return to a more normal situation of considerable power conflicts. And we've also seen the end of the current round of globalisation with the actions of the Trump administration to dramatically increase tariffs in an effort to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And this all means really the end of effective cooperation to reduce global emissions, if that ever existed. So we see here, this is a map that shows how the world's largest emitters, China, the United States, India and Russia, which together are responsible for more than 50% of global emissions, are failing to take adequate action to reduce their emissions, according to the Climate Action Tracker website. The other major emitters, such as Indonesia, Brazil, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are also not doing much. So what's the value then of emissions reductions from a mid-sized nation like ours here in Australia? A few years ago, the answer would have been to be seen as a good international citizen, but that doesn't really work in the dark forest. So some would say that in 2025, politicians proposing emissions reduction strategies for Australia are doing it for domestic political consumption. And this really brings us to what will come up this Saturday, our federal election. And what Gordon's going to do now is really run through a little bit of a conversation about what's on offer from the major parties.
Yeah.
Gordon.
Thanks, Deanna. So the first thing to point out is that in recent election campaigns have really been continuations of climate wars fought between the left and right of politics in this country and elsewhere in the world. In fact, some say that every prime minister since John Howard has lost their job because of climate change politics. But this election is different. Climate change and the clean energy transition have not been front of mind issues. In fact, the slide shows what the voters see as the important issues, and not surprisingly, the cost of living dominates everything else. However, while climate change is not viewed as an important issue, its close associate, energy, is a significant issue in 2025. The cost of energy, particularly electricity, is a major concern of voters and sits within the broader cost of living concerns. The major parties are pushing different energy policies, and both sides of politics claim their solution will result in lower electricity prices. So now let's have a look at the climate and energy policies of the major parties, beginning with the emissions reduction targets. And of course, say that don't our politicians love their targets, especially targets beyond the current terms of government. That way they can avoid the unpopular actions required to actually achieve the targets. So here we see the emissions reduction targets, and I'm sure many of you are aware of what those targets are. But what we see that despite all the noise we hear in the election campaign, then there's actually very little difference between what the major parties offer. Both are still committed to net zero by 2050. Neither major party is willing to commit to a 2035 target. The coalition says they will review the 2030 target should they be elected, accounting for, among other things, the feasibility of achieving that 43% target. Well, here's a little secret. Australia will not achieve its 2030 emissions reduction target. There is just too much to do and too little time to do it in. I mean, after all, 2030 is now only 5 years away. So the 43% reduction target is academic anyway, and the same can be said about the net zero by 2050, but that's another story. Now, we won't even discuss what the Greens and Teals propose. If net zero by 2050 is not achievable, net zero by 25 is, well, an insurmountable challenge. Now, there's a bit more to discuss when we come to renewables, and more precisely renewable electricity generation, and that's what we'll look at now. The key component to Labor's 43% emissions reduction strategy is achieving 82% renewables in the national electricity market by 2030. This has been a policy of the outgoing government. The government has several policies and initiatives designed to support the development of an electricity system dominated by renewables. These include the Capacity Investment Scheme to support the development of renewable generation and storage, the Rewiring the Nation Fund to support the development of transmission infrastructure, and direct government ownership of and funding of projects such as Snowy 2. The Coalition proposes to cut back on several Labor initiatives on renewable energy. The result will be to slow the development of renewable generation and the associated transmission infrastructure. The Coalition has no renewable target for 2030, but it does say that 54% of electricity will be renewable by 2050. Nuclear will provide most of the remaining generation capacity, which is essential for consistency with its own net zero by 2050 target. This also means that more gas-fired generation will be needed to fill the gap, but Labor has come to exactly the same conclusion. So now we look at the different sources of the different components of our energy mix. Both sides of politics have acknowledged the role of natural gas in the medium-term generation mix. Gas-fired generators are needed to firm the renewable generators. However, there are some interesting differences elsewhere. An electricity grid that has a lot of wind and solar requires more transmission lines, and so Labor's energy policy suite includes initiative to expand the transmission system and resolve some of the bottlenecks that currently exist. The Coalition's energy policy does not rely on a high penetration of wind and solar, so they propose to reduce the amount of government support for expanding the electricity networks. Energy storage is a key part of Labor's renewable energy policy, as energy storage is required to support the variable renewables, such as wind and solar. Therefore, they propose a national battery strategy to manufacture batteries in Australia. One could say good luck with that, given the technological and scale advantage that the Chinese companies already have. As we have said before, the Coalition is not keen on supporting renewables, as it sees the resultant network as expensive and unreliable. And we think of Spain and Portugal at the moment, but to be fair, the jury is still out over what caused the national blackouts there. But it did highlight the importance of reliable electricity and the social and financial impact of an extensive blackout. So what we can say is that a power system is not a toy to be played with by politicians for short-term political advantage. But the really interesting policy difference is nuclear power, where the Coalition proposes to build nuclear power plants and the Labor Party does not. Now, our few minutes for this briefing do not allow us time to discuss the advantages and disadvantages, feasibility or infeasibility, costs and benefits of nuclear power versus no nuclear power. But fortunately, there's no shortage of discussions in the literature and the media that discuss nuclear power. Renewable developers and others investing in the net zero transition will face a new level of uncertainty and risk. And with that in mind, I'll now turn to Deanna to wrap up and examine what all of this means for business.
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. So I think, as you can see, really, regardless of which party wins the election on Saturday, your stakeholders will still want to understand how climate change and the net zero transition will affect your business. And this includes the physical risk to your asset and the risk to your operations from the transition to a net zero world. So despite earlier comments about the timing, we're still going to transition to net zero, and this will pose risks to businesses. And you really should understand and disclose them. And large organisations, of course, in Australia are already obligated to report on climate change risk. And over the next few years, more and more businesses will also be obligated to do this as well. So remember, as the world's climate changes, assets will be exposed to more extreme weather conditions, and that is going to continue regardless. A recent media radical explained that insurers are finding it more and more difficult to assess risk to assets and so set premiums. And we're finding that, in fact, in some jurisdictions, insurance is simply not possible, such that we're seeing the example, for example, against forest fires in California, where those areas are now, frankly, uninsurable. And so that's certainly a major risk to businesses. So I think with that, our message to you today is really that despite this election not being about climate change, cost of living, as Gordon says, is, I think, front and centre of mind for many in our country. You really can't afford to ignore it. So we're really happy and keen now to open the floor to questions, and Pat is going to help to moderate this from his end as well. And we're keen that, we're very keen to be here to maybe offer some insights and perspectives. And as I said, the floor is open. Pat, if you can help us a little bit to moderate,
Yeah, so we had one question come through from Adam, and it's an awesome question because it kind of relates to manufacturing. And Gordon, you'd mentioned partway through there this idea that Australia would take on some more battery manufacturing, maybe, or try to compete with China. Um, One of the things that we reflect on in Sydney Executive Plus is actually geopolitical changes in the world. That's actually another one of our sprints that we run, and we talk about a trend towards countries doing more manufacturing domestically. In Australia, over the past 3 years, we've had the Future Made in Australia program. And so for that, you're seeing a growth in manufacturing potentially in Australia. Adams asked, what recommendations would you make to policymakers who have made net zero and emissions targets, but also wish to grow manufacturing, which relies on cheap, reliable, stable energy? And as some background, he's said South Australia has some of the highest electricity prices in the world, despite its renewables credentials.
Now that's a challenging question, because the two issues, the transition and domestic manufacturing, do oppose each other in some respects, because the transition is going to be very, very expensive. McKinsey's, they did an analysis quite recently and concluded that this is for the world, the whole thing would cost $275 trillion. And looking at just what component of that was above business as usual, concluded it was $3.5 trillion a year, which is 7-8% of global GDP. So it's a major expense at a time when societies are worried about costs. Now, the challenge with bringing manufacturing back into countries is that our supply chains have just got so complex that it is going to take a long, long time to unravel. During the debate leading into Liberation Day, as it's called, in the United States, the domestic car manufacturers were pointing out how many dozens of times stuff crosses from the United States to Canada or the United States to Mexico and back, just to make small parts, individual parts of cars. And you think of the supply chains for any complex thing like a laptop, or is it cars, or any type of modern equipment. They are just so complex, you can't do it all in one location. So, to try and do that, well, we're all going to end up like North Korea.
Thanks, Gordon. And our next question has come from Ilona, which is, what kind of changes have there been in consumer or voter attitudes and preferences, and how much impact do you think they will have on the energy transition?
Oh, right. That's an interesting one. Well, we've seen two things. Everybody's concerned about cost of living, and for very good reasons. And electricity prices have been rising. The transition is transitioning to a 100% renewable electricity grid is going to take a lot of cost, and it will take time. And if that starts to be seen by the citizens as contributing to increasing electricity prices, they will push back, and politicians will be aware of that pushback and will respond accordingly. Now, that's not to say that we won't achieve very, very high levels of renewables. It's just a matter of how long it's going to take. And because it's certainly true that wind and solar are the cheapest way of producing electrons, but they need more stuff to go with them to support the fact that they're not they only work when the sun's shining or the wind's blowing. And that stuff will go into the networks over time, but it's only if you try and do it too quickly that it will get extremely expensive. And I think so what we may well see is a slowing down of the transition, because right now nobody is willing to spend a lot of money to achieve it.
It's a really interesting point you raise, because I think what we know from a lot of the polls is that voter sentiment towards the actual idea of the transition doesn't really change. It's been relatively stable. What has changed dramatically is the cost of living pressure. And if energy sort of gets wrapped up in that, then that's just the state of things.
Yes, yes, it is. And there is a long history of citizens all around the world, people around the world saying, yeah, we're all for doing something about climate change or the environment, but we're not so keen on us actually having to pay for it. So,
have you considered also, I think Mark Carney, the now re-elected Prime Minister of Canada, had actually been walking back some of the, I think, carbon prices for some industries over there. Is that right?
Oh yeah, well yes, because they see that as an impediment to things like domestic manufacture and increasing the cost of living. I mean, one of the things I reflect on, and it does highlight the challenges we face. That every time, and this seems to be an issue around the world, every time some disruption causes prices to go up. I'm thinking most recently of the Ukraine war. Politicians seem to strive to come up with ways of getting those prices down. So the price of gas, for instance, down. They don't say, "Oh, great, that will mean people use less gas, so we'll get our climate change objectives. We'll be a little closer to achieving our climate change objectives." So I think it's this idea that people will only want to spend so much on a societal benefit, and politicians are aware of that.
Maya has asked, what's the way forward for Australian environmental law to reduce or limit emissions caused by the mining industry? Are there any bills in play at the moment?
Well, there's the safeguard mechanism.
Yes.
Actually, the safeguard mechanism is Tony Abbott's carbon tax, because it's been adopted without change by the current Labor government, and is legislated by the Abbott government. All Labor did was reduce the targets, because the previous coalition governments had set the targets way too high. So that will reduce the emissions from. Should it reduce the emissions from the big miners? But so many of those facilities will be subject to the safeguard mechanism, so their emissions are capped. And if they exceed their emissions, they've got to do stuff to get their emissions back to back below what's called their baseline. And what they should be doing is reducing their on-site emissions. They shouldn't just be getting somebody to plant trees somewhere and claiming those offsets, but the effect is to reduce the emissions.
That actually brings us back to it. I'm mindful of the time, so this may actually be the last question that we have time for. But Ilona's asked a follow-up question, which I think ties quite nicely to what you were just talking about, Gordon. Is the current focus in industry more on transitioning to renewable energy sources or reducing energy consumption? And I know, and also, I guess, Deanna, another question in the mix here, part of your research as well, is, are there other ways for us to deal with the carbon already in the atmosphere? I think this sort of comes out of what you talk about in the net zero sprint quite a bit. So, yeah.
It's a very good question, and I think it's a bit of both. There is a big push towards renewables, and particularly renewable electricity. So one of the activities that drove investment in renewables in this country are what are called renewable power purchase agreements, where large electricity consumers will pay a developer to build a wind farm or a solar farm, and they get all of the what are called the renewable energy certificates, the credit for the zero emissions electricity, and that way they reduce their emissions associated with electricity generation. For instance, the big mining companies are all looking at electrifying heavy vehicles, or electrifying any vehicle, be it a light vehicle or a very heavy vehicle, is a way of reducing emissions, and it is a switching fuels, relying on the fact the electricity that they're using is low emissions electricity. Reducing energy consumption, well, that goes on all the time because manufacturing operations are always trying to reduce costs. And one way to reduce costs is to reduce the amount of energy they have to purchase. And that has the benefit of also reducing associated emissions.
Yeah, and I think just sort of almost wrapping up, maybe coming full circle in the conversation, is that the transition itself has been a real opportunity for many businesses. And in fact, as Gordon said, it's not only looking for efficiencies in energy or in general in resource use, but actually the transition is good for business, for many businesses, where it's been an opportunity actually to improve operations and ultimately improve the resilience of the business. The risk of climate change is there regardless, the physical and transition risks. And so regardless of whether, policies are in place, businesses still need to address those risks. And in many cases, we're seeing actually really positive outcomes from doing so. Pat, I might round it up here, just given timing, but perhaps just to note that actually the amazing Gordon is on display in this incredible net zero sprint that gives you a great short and sharp introduction to reporting. Gordon, any final thoughts?
Well, thank you for attending, and I'm sure we all look forward to, with bated breath, to what happens on Saturday night.
Yes. Take care. We hope this has been really useful to you.
Thanks both, Gordon and Deanna.
Thanks,
very
Pat.
much. Thank you so much for your time today, and everybody else. The Net Zero Sprint, which you see on screen here, there's a discount available to you if you register for that. To Ragini's question, this is probably one way that businesses can actually address their transition plans. So there's a lot of good quality learning from Gordon and Deanna and experts at the University of Sydney that can help out.
Thanks, Pat.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.